Tommy Kirk made millions for Disney, but Walt Disney fired him immediately upon discovering his relationship with another man. At 21, he was expelled from Hollywood because the studio viewed his private life as a moral stain unfit for children. From a national idol, he became unemployed and despised by the entire country. That humiliation drove Tommy into severe drug addiction to escape his reality. When the money ran out, the old Yeller star had to work as a laborer, kneeling on floors to scrub dirty carpets and clean toilets for strangers for 20 years just to eat. He died alone in an empty house in Las Vegas, his body found in absolute isolation, with no wife, no children, and no family by his side. In the early 1950s, Hollywood was in panic mode as television began stealing audiences from theaters. While rivals tried technical gimmicks like 3D to survive, Walt Disney saw a smarter path. He realized animation was too slow and expensive to keep his studio safe. To secure steady revenue, Disney pivoted to live-action films, which were faster and cheaper to produce than cartoons. To succeed, Disney needed a new kind of star who truly embodied the studio's moral code. He wasn't looking for the polished perfection of a stage school actor. Instead, he wanted a face that projected raw honesty, grit, and a lack of pretension. The studio quietly began hunting for this specific rougher quality, a search that led them directly to Tommy Kirk. After the Kirk family settled in working-class Los Angeles during the 1940s, young Tommy stood out for his gravelly voice and real boy appearance rather than traditional cuteness, leading his parents to push him toward acting as a source of income. He viewed the work strictly as labor rather than art, a mindset that became essential when he entered the unforgiving casting circuit of 1954 at just 13 years old. In an era without protections for child actors, Tommy had to navigate fierce competition and blunt rejection, treating the brutal industry simply as the hard job it was. Behind this professional demeanor lay a deeper, more personal tragedy regarding his home life. Kirk later confessed that he felt his parents, particularly his mother, did not value him as a son, but rather as a financial asset. He described a childhood devoid of genuine affection, where love was conditional on his ability to secure roles and bring home paychecks. This transactional relationship with his own family meant that Tommy had no safe harbor. He was exploited by his employers during the day and viewed as a meal ticket at night. Tommy secured an agent who recognized his unique marketability. He was the anti-star. He did not look like he was wearing makeup. He looked like the boy who delivered the newspaper. This everyman quality helped him land his first significant role in 1956 for a television anthology series called TV Reader's Digest. The episode was titled The Last of the Old-Time Shooting Sheriffs. It was a minor production. However, it required Tommy to memorize significant dialogue and hold his own against adult actors. He did not falter. He delivered his lines with a naturalism that was rare for child actors of that era, who were often trained to over-enunciate and mug for the camera. Tommy did not act. He simply existed on screen. This naturalism caught the eye of the casting department at Walt Disney Studios. In 1956, the Mickey Mouse Club was the most important television show for children in America. It was a variety show that aired daily. It was a marketing juggernaut. To keep the content fresh, Disney produced serials, short, episodic, live-action segments that aired within the show. Walt Disney wanted to adapt The Hardy Boys, the famous mystery novel series. The studio needed 2 boys to play Frank and Joe Hardy. They had already cast Tim Considine, a polished and experienced young actor, as Frank Hardy, the older brother. They needed a Joe. The casting call went out. Dozens of boys auditioned. The studio needed someone who could contrast with Considine. Considine was smooth, handsome, and athletic. The actor playing Joe needed to be scrappier, more impulsive, and more vulnerable. Tommy Kirk went to the Burbank lot for the audition. He read the sides, the script pages. He did not try to impress the casting directors with charm. He read the lines with a serious, intense demeanor. When Walt Disney reviewed the screen tests, he pointed to Kirk. Disney famously operated on instinct. He did not care about resumes. He cared about the eyes. He felt that Kirk had expressive eyes that the camera loved. Disney saw potential for profit. He saw a boy who could sell emotions without saying a word. Tommy Kirk was offered the role of Joe Hardy. However, this was not a simple employment agreement. It was an entry into a rigid corporate system. The contract Tommy's parents signed was standard for the era, but draconian by modern standards. It bound Tommy to the studio exclusively. Disney owned his image. Disney owned his likeness for merchandising. Disney controlled his public appearances. In exchange, Tommy received a salary. It was a good wage for a teenager, but it was a pittance compared to the value he created. The contract had options, meaning the studio could fire him at 6-month intervals, but he could not quit. It was a unilateral agreement. Tommy entered the studio system in late 1956. He began filming The Hardy Boys, The Mystery of the Applegate Treasure. The production was efficient and low budget. They filmed on the Disney backlot. Tommy learned the technical side of filmmaking immediately. He learned to hit his marks, stand in the right place for focus. He learned to match his actions for continuity. He learned to work fast. The chemistry between Tommy Kirk and Tim Considine was electric. They felt like real brothers. When the serial aired in October 1956, the response was immediate. The ratings for the Mickey Mouse Club spiked during the Hardy Boys segments. Fan mail began to arrive at the studio. Much of it was directed at Tim Considine, the traditional heartthrob. But a significant portion was directed at Tommy Kirk. The audience resonated with his intensity. He was the underdog. By early 1957, Walt Disney knew he had a star. The Hardy Boys serial was a massive success. The studio commissioned a second serial, The Mystery of the Ghost Farm. However, Disney had bigger plans. The studio had purchased the rights to a novel by Fred Gibson titled Old Yeller. It was a story about a frontier family in 1860s Texas and a stray dog. It was a grim, emotional story. It required a young actor who could carry the entire emotional weight of the film. The role of Travis Coates was complex. Travis was the man of the house while his father was away. He had to be tough, responsible, and capable of killing. But he also had to be a child who loved his dog. Most executives would have hired a famous name or looked for a movie star look. Walt Disney did not hesitate. He bypassed the casting process entirely for the lead role. He selected the boy from the Hardy Boys. He called Tommy Kirk into his office. He told the 15-year-old boy that he was going to be the lead in a major motion picture. He told him that the success of the film rested on his shoulders. At that moment, standing in the office of the most powerful man in entertainment, Tommy Kirk felt a mix of pride and terror. He had no formal training. He was just a kid from Louisville. Now he was being asked to anchor a multi-million-dollar production. With the ink drying on a contract that bound him to the studio's rigid moral and professional strictures, Tommy Kirk stepped onto the sound stage of Old Yeller. He was no longer just a promising child actor. He was about to become the emotional anchor for a story Walt Disney intended to be a masterpiece of heartbreak. The carefree days of the Hardy Boys were over. The era of Travis Coates and the crushing weight of global fame that came with it was about to begin. The production of Old Yeller began in early 1957. It was not merely a film, it was a calculated emotional weapon. Walt Disney intended to create a movie that would traumatize and bond a generation of children. At the center of this strategy was 15-year-old Tommy Kirk. The role of Travis Coates required a level of emotional maturity that few adult actors possessed. Travis was not a passive child. He was the acting patriarch of a frontier family. He managed the farm, hunted for food, and protected his mother and younger brother. The physical demands were significant, but the psychological demands were crushing. The climax of the film, the scene where Travis must shoot his beloved dog because it has contracted rabies, is considered one of the most pivotal moments in cinema history. It was shot on a soundstage in Burbank, under the direction of Robert Stevenson. Kirk later recalled the atmosphere on set during that week. There was no joking. The crew was silent. Stevenson, a director known for his precision, did not coddle the boy. He needed genuine devastation. He needed Travis to look like he was killing a part of himself. When the cameras rolled, Tommy Kirk did not use stage tricks. He did not use tear sticks. He tapped into a reserve of genuine pain. The tears that streamed down his face were real. The trembling of his hands as he raised the gun was not acting. It was the physical manifestation of an adolescent carrying an unbearable burden. When the film was released in December 1957, the reaction was seismic. Grown men wept in theaters. Children were inconsolable. The film grossed an estimated $10 million in its initial run, an astronomical sum for the time. Critically, Tommy Kirk was hailed as a revelation. The New York Times praised his sensitive, unaffected performance. He had achieved the impossible. He had made a boy and his dog movie feel like a Greek tragedy. To fully appreciate the singularity of this success, one must understand that in the 1950s, child acting was largely defined by theatricality. Children were often trained to be performers, to project to the back row, to mug for the camera, to be precocious and adorable. Tommy Kirk was different. He was a practitioner of accidental naturalism. He had no formal training in the method, the Stanislavski system, popular in New York. Yet his performances exhibit all the hallmarks of deep emotional recall. When he cried, his face contorted in an ugly, genuine way that most directors would have corrected. He didn't look pretty when he was emotional. He looked devastated. This rough edge was his greatest asset. In the highly polished Technicolor world of Walt Disney, a world where trees were often made of plaster and the lighting was always perfect, Tommy Kirk was the element of reality. He grounded the fantasy. If Old Yeller proved Tommy Kirk could cry, the Shaggy Dog proved he could sell. By 1959, the teenager demographic was becoming a distinct economic force in America. Rock and roll was exploding. Drive-in theaters were cultural hubs. Walt Disney, ever the opportunist, realized he needed to pivot Tommy Kirk from frontier boy to modern teenager. The Shaggy Dog was a gamble. It was a live-action fantasy comedy about a boy who turns into a sheepdog. On paper, it was absurd. It was the first live-action comedy Disney had ever attempted on this scale. Tommy Kirk was cast as Wilby Daniels, a clumsy, socially awkward teenager who is terrified of girls and his own changing body. It was a metaphor for puberty that audiences understood implicitly. The production was low budget. It was shot in black and white to save money. The special effects were primitive, yet the film relied entirely on Kirk's comedic timing. He played the role with a frantic, nervous energy that was hilarious and relatable. He was the antithesis of the cool rebels like James Dean or Marlon Brando. He was the boy who tripped over his own feet. The gamble paid off spectacularly. The Shaggy Dog grossed over $9 million, making it more profitable than Ben-Hur in terms of return on investment. It launched a new genre, the Disney live-action comedy, a formula the studio would mine for decades. For Tommy Kirk, this success was a double-edged sword. He was now the undisputed king of the Disney lot. He was the face of the studio's live-action division. He was on the cover of magazines. Merchandise bearing his likeness was sold in every department store, but he saw almost none of the money. By 1960, Tommy Kirk was arguably the most profitable teenager in the world. His films had grossed nearly $20 million combined. In today's currency, his box office draw would be equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars. His compensation, however, remained tied to his original contract. He was a salaried employee. He received approximately $1,200 to $1,500 per week. While this was a comfortable upper-middle-class wage, it was a fraction of his market value. He received no residuals. Every time Old Yeller was re-released, Disney kept 100% of the profit. Every time a Shaggy Dog toy was sold, Disney kept 100% of the profit. Tommy was not represented by a shark-like agent who could renegotiate. His parents, while well-meaning, were not Hollywood insiders. They were grateful for the steady paycheck. They did not understand that their son was being underpaid by a factor of 10. Furthermore, the morals clause in his contract became a tightening noose. This was not merely a standard business term. It was a legal weapon originating from the Lavender Scare era of Hollywood. The clause stipulated that he must conduct himself with due regard to public conventions and morals. In the 1950s, the moral turpitude clause in contracts was frequently employed to penalize certain private behaviors deemed unacceptable, acting as a veiled term for prohibited conduct. This provision generated a stark contradiction for those in prominent positions. Achieving fame necessitated public exposure, yet personal security required complete discretion. For a young individual concealing their innermost inclinations, this clause transcended mere contractual wording. It embodied an ever-present danger to their livelihood and existence. This persistent apprehension triggered significant inner turmoil, fostering self-contempt and the adoption of views that portrayed personal urges as inherently flawed. Compounded by spiritual doctrines and prevailing social attitudes that condemned such traits as both unlawful and psychologically aberrant, the person became ensnared in a relentless struggle. Their career advancement hinged on denying authentic aspects of themselves, resulting in mounting mental tension that threatened to unravel their stability. The physical exploitation of Tommy Kirk reached its zenith during the production of Swiss Family Robinson. This was the most ambitious live-action film Disney had ever produced. It was an epic adventure about a shipwrecked family surviving on a deserted island. Walt Disney refused to film it on a backlot. He wanted realism. He chose the island of Tobago in the West Indies. Tobago in 1959 was not a tourist destination. It was a wild, underdeveloped jungle. The production logistics were a nightmare. The cast and crew were isolated from civilization for 6 months. Tommy Kirk, now 18, played Ernst Robinson, the intellectual and slightly arrogant older brother. The shoot was physically brutal. The heat was relentless, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, and 90% humidity. The actors were in period costumes, heavy wool and cotton, while running, climbing, and fighting. The danger was real. Kirk performed many of his own stunts. In the famous scene where the family battles pirates, Kirk was handling real explosives and wrestling with stuntmen in treacherous water. In the scene where he wrestles an anaconda, the snake was real. Although the snake's mouth was sewn shut, a common cruelty of the time, the animal was still a powerful constrictor capable of crushing a human rib cage. Illness plagued the set. Dysentery and tropical fevers swept through the cast. Kirk spent days filming while violently ill, often having to pause between takes to vomit or recover from dizziness. There were no child labor laws that applied in Tobago. The Screen Actors Guild had little power there. Tommy worked 6 days a week, often from sunrise to sunset. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and isolated. Yet on screen, he looked magnificent. The film was a masterpiece of adventure. It went on to gross $40 million, becoming the highest-grossing film of 1960. It solidified Disney's dominance. It also solidified Tommy Kirk's status as a beefcake idol, as scenes of him shirtless, building the treehouse began to appear in teen magazines. While the world saw a rugged, handsome hero, Tommy Kirk was living a life of quiet desperation. By 1961, at 19, he fully accepted his personal identity. In early 1960s America, this realization posed immense risks. Such identities were outlawed in California, with Los Angeles police raiding social venues and arresting people for improper actions. Names appeared in newspapers, shattering lives and careers. For a Disney star, the peril was amplified. The studio promoted classic American ideals, stable families, traditional relationships, and core values. A lead actor with differing traits threatened the brand's foundation. Tommy was forced to construct an elaborate facade. The studio publicity department arranged fake dates for him. The most famous was with Annette Funicello, the queen of the Mickey Mouse Club. They were photographed drinking milkshakes, holding hands at Disneyland, and attending premieres. The magazines ran headlines about their puppy love. In reality, they were just friends, colleagues who respected each other but had zero romantic chemistry. Comparing Kirk to his contemporary Tab Hunter highlights how the machine treated assets differently. Tab Hunter, the top teen idol of the 1950s and also gay, received protection from Warner Brothers because he was marketed as a mature romantic figure appealing to women. In contrast, Tommy Kirk embodied Disney's innocent kid image. When Hunter faced issues, his studio viewed it as solvable. For Kirk, Disney saw him as irreparably tainted. This duality began to corrode his mental health. He was surrounded by beautiful young men on sets but couldn't look at them. He was worshipped by millions of girls he couldn't love. He was the loneliest person in Hollywood. As 1963 approached, the strain of maintaining this dual existence, the wholesome Disney hero on screen and the terrified young man off screen, reached its breaking point. The glass closet that protected him was fragile, held together only by studio publicists and Tommy's own silence. It took only one slip, one moment of vulnerability in a public space for the entire structure to collapse. During the filming of The Misadventures of Merlin Jones, a comedy featuring Tommy Kirk as a brilliant college student, a personal crisis emerged. Kirk had met a teenage boy at a Burbank public pool, and the boy's parents discovered their private meetings. Under questioning, the boy admitted to having spent time alone with the actor. Instead of contacting authorities, the mother went straight to the administration offices of Walt Disney Studios. In the strict corporate climate of 1963, this was treated as a critical emergency. Disney's entire brand depended on an image of pure, wholesome family entertainment. Any scandal touching their leading star, the face of Old Yeller, and the Shaggy Dog, was seen as a direct threat to the company's reputation and financial future. Tommy was summoned to the executive offices. He expected a lecture on discretion. He expected a suspension. He did not expect to see Walt Disney himself. The meeting was brief, clinical, and devastating. Walt Disney, the man who had personally selected Tommy, the man who had been a surrogate father figure for 7 years, did not ask for an explanation. He did not offer legal help. He did not offer psychiatric support, which was the standard fix for gay actors at the time. According to Kirk's later accounts, Disney looked at him with cold detachment. There was no anger, only a business decision being executed. The words were simple. "We don't need guys like you around here." It was a termination for moral turpitude. In an instant, Tommy Kirk went from being the highest-grossing asset on the lot to a liability. He was escorted off the property. He was not allowed to clear out his dressing room. He was not allowed to say goodbye to the crew he had grown up with. He was erased. The brutality of Hollywood is often masked by public relations, but in Tommy Kirk's case, the cynicism was naked. Disney fired him for being gay, yet the studio still had the misadventures of Merlin Jones in the can. They released the film in early 1964, fully aware of the moral risk they believed Tommy posed. To their shock, the film was a massive hit. It grossed over $4 million in the U.S. alone, a huge return on a shoestring budget. The audience, unaware of the internal firing, loved Tommy Kirk. They wanted more. Faced with a demand for a sequel, Disney made a decision that exposed the hollowness of their moral stance. They rehired the man they had just fired. They brought Tommy back to film The Monkey's Uncle, 1965. However, the terms were humiliating. He was not welcomed back as a Disney legend. He was hired as a freelancer. He was paid a flat fee. He was treated like a contagious disease on set. Interactions were kept to a minimum. The studio extracted one final performance from him, one final paycheck, and then the moment the cameras wrapped, they discarded him again. This time, it was permanent. The Monkey's Uncle became a box office success, featuring a title track sung by the Beach Boys and Annette Funicello. Tommy Kirk, the star, was not invited to the premiere. In 1964, there was no internet, but news in Hollywood traveled at the speed of light. Disney did not issue a press release stating why Tommy Kirk was fired. They didn't have to. The silence did the work. Casting directors at other major studios, Fox, Paramount, Universal, suddenly stopped returning his agent's calls. Roles he had been shortlisted for evaporated. The most painful loss was The Sons of Katie Elder, 1965. This was a prestigious Western starring John Wayne and Dean Martin. It was exactly the kind of adult role Tommy needed to transition his career. He was initially cast in the role of the youngest brother, Bud Elder. This role would have established him as a credible Western actor, escaping the Disney stereotype and securing John Wayne's mentorship, whose Hollywood clout could have swiftly ended any blacklisting. Yet when industry whispers about his Disney firing reached the producers, the offer was withdrawn and the part went to Michael Anderson Jr. This was the mechanism of the blacklist. It was not official. It was not written down. It was a systemic exclusion based on fear. Studios feared that if the public found out about Tommy's personal life, their investments would be worthless. So, they simply didn't hire him. Desperate for money and desperate to work, Tommy signed a contract with the only studio that would take him, American International Pictures, AIP. AIP was the antithesis of Disney. They were a B-movie factory. They churned out low-budget horror, sci-fi, and teen exploitation films. They did not care about prestige, they cared about putting bodies in seats. Tommy was cast in Pajama Party, 1964. He played a Martian named Go-Go, who comes to Earth to invade a teenage slumber party. It was a role that required him to wear a silver jumpsuit and act like a buffoon. For an actor who had delivered the nuanced, tragic performance in Old Yeller, this was a professional degradation. He was no longer acting. He was performing a caricature of himself. The scripts were written in days. The sets were flimsy. The direction was non-existent. He followed this with The Ghost in the Invisible Bikini, 1966, and Village of the Giants, 1965, where he played a teenager who grows to 50 feet tall. While these films were initially seen as failures, a strange cultural phenomenon later occurred. The gay community, the very group he had been forced to hide from, began to reclaim Tommy Kirk through the lens of camp. Watching a closeted Tommy Kirk in a silver jumpsuit in Pajama Party interacting awkwardly with bikini-clad girls became a form of in-joke for gay audiences. They saw the performance behind the performance. They recognized the panic in his eyes. They saw a brother trying to survive. But for Tommy Kirk at the time, they were a daily reminder of his fall. He later described this period as selling my soul to pay the rent. He was being mocked by the industry. Critics savaged him. The Disney boy was now a joke. The rejection inflicted profound psychological damage on Tommy as he grappled with the pain of severing ties with his adoptive family at Disney. Societal stigma surrounding his personal identity and the embarrassment tied to his present job. He did what many traumatized young people do. He self-medicated. He began with marijuana, which was common in the counterculture of the 60s. But marijuana wasn't strong enough to numb the pain of his reality. He graduated to Seconal, a powerful barbiturate, and eventually to illegal narcotics. In December 1964, the nightmare scenario occurred. Tommy was at a party in loose association with the counterculture movement. Police raided the house. He was arrested for possession of marijuana. The mugshot was devastating. The clean-cut boy from Old Yeller was now a drug addict in the eyes of the press. The headlines were sensational. Disney star jailed. The arrest destroyed what little was left of his reputation. Even AIP, the studio of exploitation, began to see him as a risk. He was acquitted of the charges due to an illegal search, but the damage was done. The public saw a fallen angel. By 1966, Tommy Kirk was spiraling. He was effectively unemployable in mainstream Hollywood. He was living in a haze of substance abuse. He nearly died from an overdose of barbiturates. It was not explicitly a suicide attempt, but it was a cry for help from a young man who saw no future. He woke up in a hospital, alone. The late 1960s were a blur of minor roles in unwatchable films. Movies like Mars Needs Women, 1967, and It's a Bikini World, 1967. He was working for scraps. He was 26 years old, and his career was effectively over. He tried to study acting again. He attended the Actors Studio. He tried to do theater, but the stigma was too strong. He was Tommy Kirk, the Disney failure. He couldn't walk into a room without people seeing the ghost of the boy he used to be. The isolation was not just professional, it was social. In the paranoid atmosphere of the 1960s, former friends crossed the street to avoid him. He wasn't just unemployed, he was viewed as contaminated. The psychological weight of carrying a shameful secret, one that was an intrinsic part of his identity, created a fracture in his psyche. He was fighting a war against his own nature, a battle no young man could win alone. By the early 1970s, Tommy Kirk faced a binary choice: continue to chase a dream that was killing him, or vanish. He realized that Hollywood was a toxic relationship. It was an abusive partner that kept promising love but only delivered pain. He realized that his identity as an actor was the source of his misery. In 1973, he made the most courageous decision of his life. He stopped auditioning. He fired his agent. He stopped returning calls. He decided to get clean. He went through the agonizing process of withdrawal without expensive rehab centers. He did it through sheer force of will, driven by a desire to survive. He looked for work that had no connection to the entertainment industry. He didn't want applause. He wanted a paycheck that didn't require him to sell his soul. He tried driving a truck. He tried odd jobs. Eventually, he found his exit strategy. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't artistic. It was manual labor. He started a small business in the San Fernando Valley. He bought a van. He bought industrial cleaning equipment. And he printed business cards that read, "Tommy Kirk's Carpet and Upholstery Cleaning." The boy who had once generated $40 million for Walt Disney was now on his hands and knees scrubbing dirt out of shag carpets in suburban living rooms. To the world, it looked like a tragedy. To Tommy Kirk, it felt like freedom. By 1975, this transformation had become his permanent reality. The industrial steam cleaning machine became his new instrument, and the noise of the vacuum drowned out the memories of applause. For the next 20 years, the daily grind of manual labor provided the rigid structure he needed to stay sober, offering a zen-like peace far removed from the chaos of Hollywood. His routine was punishingly consistent. He woke up at 6 a.m. He drove to clients' homes. He hauled heavy hoses and equipment up flights of stairs. He spent hours on his knees scrubbing stains out of carpets. The physical labor served a dual purpose. First, it paid the bills, but more importantly, it provided a rigid structure that his life had lacked. In Hollywood, his schedule was dictated by shooting scripts and studio whims. In the carpet business, he was the owner, the manager, and the laborer. He had autonomy. Inevitably, the two worlds collided. Tommy was cleaning carpets in the very neighborhoods where his films were still playing on television reruns. The encounters followed a specific script. A homeowner would open the door to let the cleaner in. They would see a man in work clothes, sweating, perhaps looking a bit older than his years. They would watch him work. Then a flicker of recognition would cross their face. "Excuse me?" they would ask. Often tentatively, "You look incredibly familiar." "Are you?" It was the moment that could have destroyed a lesser man. To be recognized as a fallen star while scrubbing a stranger's floor is a specific kind of psychological torture. However, Tommy Kirk developed a defense mechanism of absolute honesty. "Yes," he would say, looking them in the eye, "I'm Tommy Kirk. I used to be in movies. Now I clean carpets." He refused to be ashamed. He refused to lie. By acknowledging the reality without bitterness, he disarmed the situation. Most customers were kind, some were shocked, a few were cruel, making jokes about his fall. Tommy absorbed it all. He realized that their reaction said more about them than it did about him. He was earning an honest living. He was sober. He was alive. That was enough. The transition to manual labor coincided with his battle for sobriety. The late 1970s and early 1980s were not easy. The damage from years of barbiturate and drug abuse required time to heal. He did not go to a luxury rehabilitation center in Malibu. He did not have a team of therapists. He got clean through isolation and willpower. He cut ties with the hangers-on from his acting days. He stopped going to the parties in the Hollywood Hills. He replaced the dopamine hit of fame with the dopamine hit of physical exertion. He became an avid reader. He educated himself on subjects he had missed while working on sound stages as a child. He became interested in aviation and mechanics. By the mid-1980s, Tommy Kirk had achieved full sobriety and embraced a quiet, solitary existence. He remained unmarried and childless throughout his life. The emotional wounds from his abrupt departure from Disney, stemming from concerns that his personal orientation posed a professional risk, profoundly hindered his capacity to build intimate relationships. Though he maintained a few close friendships, he preferred small, guarded social circles. Occasionally, the phone would ring with an offer. These were not from major studios. They were from independent filmmakers who remembered him and wanted to use his name for cult value. In the 1990s, he accepted a few of these roles, but strictly for the paycheck. He delivered his lines professionally, collected his check, and returned to his cleaning business. He had no illusions left about the industry. He was not chasing stardust anymore. He was just doing a job. In 2006, the cultural landscape of America had shifted. The homophobia that had destroyed Tommy's career in 1963 was no longer the dominant corporate policy. The Walt Disney Company was under new management. Bob Iger was the CEO. The company was looking to honor its history. They reviewed the roster of stars who had built the studio. The numbers were undeniable. Tommy Kirk had starred in Old Yeller, The Shaggy Dog, and Swiss Family Robinson, three of the most profitable films in the company's history. His exclusion from the official Disney Legends list was a glaring omission. Someone in the administration made the call. They reached out to Tommy Kirk. It must have been a surreal moment. The same entity that had fired him 43 years earlier for moral turpitude was now asking to honor him. They wanted to give him a statue. They wanted to celebrate him. Tommy could have refused. He could have told them to keep their award. He could have cited the decades of lost income and psychological damage. Instead, he accepted. On October 9, 2006, Tommy Kirk returned to the Walt Disney Studios lot in Burbank. It was the same lot he had been escorted off of by security in 1963. He was 64 years old. He wore a suit. He looked weathered but dignified. He was inducted as a Disney legend alongside icons like Elton John and Peter Jennings. During the ceremony, he stood on the stage. He held the bronze award, a sculpture of Mickey Mouse's hand holding a magic wand. The applause was thunderous. In his acceptance speech, Tommy did not rage against the machine. He did not air his grievances. He spoke with a grace that shamed the industry that had rejected him. "I want to thank Walt Disney," he said. "I have nothing but fond memories of my time at the studio." It was a lie, perhaps, or perhaps it was the ultimate act of forgiveness. He acknowledged the trouble he had gotten into, but he chose to focus on the work. He chose to remember the art, not the abuse. In the 21st century, the Disney Legend Award can be seen as a form of institutional apology. While never explicitly stated, the embrace of Kirk by modern Disney leadership acknowledged that the studio's past treatment of him was a product of a prejudiced era. Kirk was finally recognized not just as an actor, but as a survivor of a system designed to erase people like him. After the ceremony, the lights went down. The executives went back to their offices, and Tommy Kirk went back to his quiet life. He had his award, but he also had his dignity, and he knew which one was worth more. Following his induction as a Disney legend in 2006, Tommy Kirk made a final geographical and psychological shift. He decided to leave Los Angeles entirely. The city held too many ghosts. It was the sight of his meteoric rise, his crushing fall, and decades of manual labor. He sold his cleaning business. He sold his home. He moved to Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas is often the final destination for aging entertainers, but Tommy did not move there to perform. He moved there for the anonymity and the low cost of living. He settled into a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. He lived on his Social Security checks and the savings he had scraped together from 20 years of cleaning carpets. This was not a glamorous retirement. There were no residual checks arriving in the mail. Despite Old Yeller and Swiss Family Robinson continuing to generate millions for Disney through DVD sales and streaming rights, Tommy Kirk received nothing. His original 1950s contract had signed away all rights to future technologies. He was a man who had generated a fortune for a corporation but was living like a pensioner. In his final years, Tommy Kirk reconnected with the only people who could truly understand his life, other former child stars. His most significant relationship was with Paul Peterson, the former star of the Donna Reed Show. Peterson had founded an organization called A Minor Consideration. Its mission was to provide support, financial, emotional, and legal, to former child actors who had been chewed up and spit out by the industry. Peterson reached out to Tommy. He didn't offer pity, he offered brotherhood. He understood the specific trauma of being America's sweetheart one day and a has-been the next. He understood the unique pain of having your childhood commodified. Tommy became a quiet member of this fraternity. He didn't attend many public events, but he kept in touch. He allowed Peterson to check in on him. For a man who had spent decades isolating himself due to shame and mistrust, this connection was a lifeline. It was an acknowledgement that his trauma was not a personal failure, but a systemic one. In private talks, Tommy started sharing more freely about his personal life. He avoided any big public announcement in magazines like People, as that wasn't his style. Instead, with close friends and colleagues, he let go of secrecy. In his last years, he embraced his identity as a gay man, having endured a time of prejudice with silent strength. In the decade leading up to his death, Tommy granted a handful of interviews to film historians and biographers. These conversations revealed a man who had processed his anger and arrived at a place of stoic acceptance. He spoke candidly about his drug use. He admitted, "I was a mess. I'm amazed I survived." He spoke about the Disney firing without rage, viewing it as a product of the time. Walt was a businessman, he would say. He did what he thought he had to do. However, he refused to romanticize Hollywood. When asked if he missed acting, his answer was almost always a flat no. He missed the money, perhaps, but he did not miss the life. He described the industry as a meat grinder. He warned parents against putting their children in movies. "I want to be remembered as a good actor," he told one interviewer. "Not a movie star, just a guy who did his job well." This distinction was crucial. Tommy Kirk valued craftsmanship over celebrity. He was proud of his performance in Old Yeller. He knew it was good work. That artistic pride was the one thing the studio couldn't take away from him. As 2020 approached, Tommy's health began to decline. He was approaching 80 years old. He lived alone. He had never married and he had no children. The isolation that had been his shield for 40 years was now his reality. In those final quiet years, a different kind of tragedy settled in. Not one of dramatic scandals, but of profound silence. Neighbors reported that he rarely had visitors. The man who had been the friend to millions of children via the screen had virtually no one to hold his hand in his declining years. The vibrant, expressive boy from Old Yeller had slowly faded into a ghost within his own home, surrounded by memorabilia of a life that felt like it. belonged to a stranger. Neighbors in Las Vegas knew him as a quiet, polite man who kept to himself. Few knew that the old man watering his lawn was the same boy who had once made millions of people cry in movie theaters. On September 28, 2021, Tommy Kirk was found deceased in his home. There was no foul play. There was no scandalous overdose. He had simply passed away from natural causes. He was 79 years old. The news did not break immediately. It filtered out through the Minor Consideration Network. Paul Peterson confirmed the death on Facebook, writing a touching tribute to his friend. "Please know that Tommy Kirk loved you, his fans," Peterson wrote. "He was estranged from what we know as the industry, but he knew you were there." When the news hit the mainstream press, the reaction was a wave of nostalgic grief. Disney issued a statement mourning the loss of a Disney legend. But for those who knew the real story, the tributes rang hollow. The industry that was now praising him was the same industry that had fired him for being gay. Tommy Kirk was cremated. His ashes were not interred in a famous Hollywood cemetery where tourists could gawk at his headstone. His remains were handled privately. This was fitting. He had spent the first half of his life as public property, his face printed on millions of comic books and lunchboxes. He spent the second half reclaiming his privacy. In death, he finally achieved total anonymity. When we watch Old Yeller today, the experience is layered with metatextual sadness. We see Travis Coates weeping over the death of his dog, but knowing what we know now, we also see a gay teenager weeping for a world that refuses to accept him. We see a boy performing masculinity for a studio head who would later fire him for failing that performance in his private life. However, Tommy Kirk was not a tragedy. To view him as such is to misunderstand his resilience. A tragedy ends in destruction. Tommy Kirk's life ended in peace. He was a man who walked through fire, child stardom, corporate betrayal, drug addiction, public humiliation, and emerged on the other side with his soul intact. He rejected the industry that rejected him. He found dignity in a steam cleaner and a carpet wand. He found community in sobriety. He found a quiet home in the desert. In the end, the boy who cried over Old Yeller grew up to be a man who didn't need Hollywood's permission to be happy. That ultimately is his greatest role.